Hi, and welcome back. We're going to start off this lesson by discussing how to use the Code of Federal Regulations. And I would say, out of all of the topics that mariners seem to gripe the most about or to have the most hesitation as far as subject matter, the Code of Federal Regulations always comes up as one of those topics that people are genuinely not too happy to deal with. And most of that usually comes from either just a lack of knowledge on how to use the regulations or just frustration in trying to find questions that maybe they've encountered in the past. And so, what I would like to do here is just kind of provide a brief overview on how to navigate the Code of Federal Regulations as you might see them throughout your course and in your examinations. The one thing about the CFRs is that as a mariner, anytime you progress or move up in your license level, you're going to deal with these CFRs. So it's almost like one of those things that you have to get comfortable with, or else it's going to torture you throughout your career. So they're not that bad. Now, I will say that there are some subjects that are a lot easier to find and to really get into the regulations and understand what they're saying, fairly easy. But then there are a few that, when I think of ones that are difficult, are like cargo handling and miscellaneous cargo and some of the hazardous materials. Some of those get a little more difficult in trying to navigate. But we're going to focus on just a couple of examples here. And I think you'll find that if you can set aside the preconceived notion that you might have for these regulations and just kind of get into the specifics of how to use it, you might feel a little bit more comfortable. All right, so let's go to the next section here. So when we think about the Code of Federal Regulations, these are regulations that are written by our government that regulate various industries. These are not just for the maritime industry. There's many entities within the government that they regulate and put policy out. The three that we are most commonly going to be exposed to or need to look something up as far as a regulation when you get out into your vessel or within your company, you might need to look something up. The three that you're going to be most interested in are Title 33, which is navigation and navigable waters, and that covers a gamut of topics from bridges to security to active duty Coast Guard and so on. 46 CFR, which covers all types of shipping, various types of vessels, inspected vessels, uninspected vessels, passenger vessels, cargo vessels, equipment, so on. And then 49, which is transportation, and a lot of what you'll see within that CFR is related to carrying liquid bulk materials for, say, tankerman courses or for regulations regarding how to transfer various cargoes on board vessels and barges. And so we're going to focus most of our efforts into the 33 and the 46 CFRs, because that's a lot of what you might encounter in your main topics, regardless of whether you're taking an OUPV, 100-ton, 1,600-ton third mate. Most of the regulations that you're going to encounter come from the 33 and the 46 sections. Now, when we talk about CFRs, this is not a 1 or 2 page document. When you go to take your exams, you may be using the full books, you might be using excerpts, which are just smaller versions of that. But if you're going to test, say, at the Regional Exam Center, there's about 10 books that you would need to find. And they look something like this. Okay, I know that's probably a little blurry, but it's going to cover different books that are a part of that particular CFR section. So the 33 CFR, which I'm holding here in my hand, has 2 different books, and it's pretty thick, right? There's 2 different books. The first one covers part 1 to 124, and the second book covers 125 to 199. And then I would get into the 46 CFRs, which look very similar, okay? But these have 6 or 7 different books that go from part 1 to 199. So you'd be gathering up, a big section of books when you go to take your exam. So it's not just one book, it's not just one chapter or subchapter, it's multiple chapters and subchapters. Now, within the 33 CFR, I mentioned that we have two different books, and that's because they are divided up by part. And so this first book covers part 1 to 124. And so it only has certain subject matter in that book. And a lot of what people encounter is they're not quite sure how to get into the book, or which book do I pull out and start reading. Well, there is kind of a process that I like to use, and we'll see that next. Essentially, we are looking at the CFR overview to kind of get an idea of where we might think it could fall. So in this example, we have the 46 CFR, which covers shipping, which is still kind of ambiguous. And then we have the 33 CFR, which is navigation and navigable waters. And so that doesn't really tell us too much. What we need to do is kind of understand how they're broken down. So this particular slide here shows us how the different titles of 46 are broken down. So we see that we have the 46 title, and then we have chapter 1, which is Coast Guard, Department of Homeland Security, and it just tells you that there are 1 to 199 parts within the 46 CFR. Now, they further break down the chapter into what's called subchapters, and that's what you see listed here. So typically they'll start with subchapter A, and they'll go down through whatever letter they get to within the alphabet. Now, this is where you're really interested in finding out which book that you need. So the book that I have in front of me for 46 CFR is part 1 to 40. So that tells me that part 1 to 40 covers subchapter A, B, C, and D. So over here, it starts with part 1 and it ends with part 40. So these 4 subchapters are included in that book. And that's parts 1 to 40. If I wanted something dealing with load lines, I would need to go to subchapter E, which would be in part 41 to 47. And that doesn't mean that's the only book, the only chapter within that part. We'd have to actually pull that book to see what's all included. But you'll notice that books will have multiple subchapters in them, most of them. And so depending on if it's really thick, like say subchapter Q it's got multiple parts within the equipment area, so it's pretty thick. So maybe that would only have one subchapter in it. But the strategy that I like to use is to just kind of consider the topic that I'm interested in. So if I wanted load lines, I know I need to find the book that has part 41 in it, excuse me. And if I wanted to know something about nautical schools, I would need subchapter R. If I wanted something about life-saving appliances and arrangements, maybe I need to know how often I need to do maintenance on my wire rope for my gravity davit. I would look in subchapter W. So the beginning part is to kind of figure out which part that I'm interested in based on the subject. Then I need to find the book that contains that part. Once I get into those parts, I will turn in a couple pages and I'm going to get basically a table of contents that's going to further expand the subchapter information that I see on this page here. So the arrows there are pointing out that if I'm interested in looking up a regulation on uninspected vessels, let's say I'm looking at like a charter boat or something like that, I would look in 46 CFR, subchapter C, and it tells me those parts are part 24 through 28. Now, the 33 CFR is broken down very similarly. And so when you look at the 33 CFR, we'll also see that we have parts 1 through 199 as the total makeup of the 33 CFR. And then within the 1 to 199, it's further broke down into subchapters that goes everything from, regattas, maritime security, bridges, pollution, and so on. Pollution is a really big one that you'll see when testing for some of your license levels. And so I would do the same strategy. I would go in and I would try to figure out the topic that I'm interested in. Let's say that I wanted to look up something related to maritime security. So if I was interested in, let's say one of my crew members lost their TWIC card and I needed to know how long I could let them on board. If I knew they had a TWIC card, I would start to venture into parts 101 to 107, fine tune what I'm looking for, and then try to find the regulation. So that's the strategy, very similar to what you would use for the 46 CFR. You just need to get into the book and find out which subchapter covers the information that you're interested in. So, like I said, each book is divided into numerous parts. Your first step is to determine which part that you need, and you've got multiple books to choose from. I always like, if I'm taking a big exam, I will take about 5 minutes and I will go ahead and write down on a piece of paper 33 CFR Part 1 to 124. I'll do a quick search of the subchapter listing and write down on my blank sheet of paper any that I feel might be on the exam. Then I'll go to Part 125 to 199 and I'll jot down any subchapters that I think would be on that exam as well. And I would do the same thing for each of the books for the 46 CFRs. And what that does for me, it gives me a quick glance at a table of contents so that I'm not constantly picking up one of these 10 books trying to figure out within the table of contents where the material is. I can glance at my paper and I know if I'm looking for passenger vessels, I'm looking for subchapter H. I know that on my paper subchapter H is part X. I can go to that book and start searching a little bit faster. So for me, it's worth writing down the various subchapters so that I can have a streamlined process to getting into the actual book that I need and then start my search, because you don't want to spend a ton of time trying to figure out just what book you need, because you've got to save some time to be able to actually look up the material that the question is asking. Now, let's say that I wanted to look up some information about bridges. So I'm going to be going under a bridge or I'm going to be approaching a bridge, and I have information that I need to either communicate or have communicated to me. And so when you look at the 33 CFR, you'll see the parts 1 to 199. And if you go in just a couple pages, page number 3 starts the table of contents. If you turn the page again to table 5, you'll see that subchapter J is bridges, okay? And that's listed right here, subchapter J. Now within subchapter J, you'll see that there's parts 114 all the way through 118. Now this gives you a little bit more of a breakdown than what you would see in your book, but we're just showing you this on one slide. So within the subchapter page, it's going to tell you the various parts that are covered. So we have a general subject, bridge locations, clearances, alteration of unobstructed bridges, drawbridge operations, and then bridge lighting and other signals. And so we get kind of a general idea on what's covered within the subchapter J or bridges section. So let's say that we wanted to find out if we're approaching a drawbridge and we need to pass through the bridge during a scheduled closure period. What signal would I sound? So the first thing I would do is in the front of the book on page 3, 4, or 5, depending on how many pages that your book has, I'm going to find subchapter J. And because I know that there's some general topics, I have general, I have bridge locations, I have obstructed bridges, I have drawbridge operation regulations, and then I have bridge lighting and other signals. So right there, I see the word drawbridge. So I'm going to start there. Now, when you use the CFRs, you don't always pick the correct place to start just based on some keywords. But a lot of times, if you pick out something specific that sounds like a keyword in the question, you can usually kind of get there and then start doing your search. So when I look at the table of contents here for the subchapter, it tells me drawbridge regulations begin in this book on page 568. Now, through the years, the United States government is always updating their information. So sometimes the page numbers will change, but the process is all the same. So if your page number is different in your reference, that's okay. Just find subchapter J and determine what page it starts on. And for me, it starts at page 568. Okay, so I'm going to turn to page 568 in my book. Okay. And this is the page that you always want to start with because this is a more detailed table of contents. So when I start looking at part 117 in my book, I've got a much more detailed table of contents to start looking at. So I've got definitions. I'm just going to peruse through some of these for you. When the drawbridge must open, permanent changes, delaying opening of a draw, signals, okay? And then I've got specific requirements for the various bridges in each state. And so that makes up a big part of this section. So when I look at signals, I have some extra information. So it says signaling for contiguous drawbridges, signaling when 2 or more vessels are approaching, signaling for an open drawbridge, installation of radio telephone, and so on. Now I'm starting to get into more of the details. So I'm going to go back to where it says signals because it says that what signal would you sound? So I'm going to start there and start looking. So now I need to find 117.15. Now that's the regulation number. Now I will tell you that if you're looking in your book or on the internet in an electronic version, each page has a number in the corner. So in each corner of the book, you'll see a number there. What that indicates is that the first regulation on the left-hand side is listed in the corner at the top, and the last regulation on the right-hand side of the page is listed at the bottom right. So it gives you every regulation that's covered on those 2 pages. So you don't have to look at the page itself to get in the vicinity of 117.15. If you just look in the corners, and you have to understand your decimal system as well, because some have 2 decimal places, some have 3, some have 4, but we're looking for 117.15. And I see on my corners that it starts at 117.7 and then it ends at 117.23. So that tells me that my particular regulation that I'm looking for does fall on one of these 2 pages. So then I'm going to go to 117.15 and I'm just going to start reading. Okay. Now, one thing that you'll find is that there's going to be some more sections within that. So I've got general, which is under letter A, and then I've got number 1, 2, and 3. So I can read through that. And then B, I have sound signals. Okay. So sound signals also have parts 1 through 5. So I might want to read those. It tells us that it can be made with whistle, horn, megaphone, hailer, or other signaling device. It talks about a prolonged blast, which is 4 to 6 seconds, and a short blast, which is about 1 second, which makes sense with the rules of the road. The sound signal to request the opening of a draw is 1 prolonged blast, followed by 1 short blast, sounded not more than 3 seconds after the prolonged blast. That's for an opening. It says, for vessels required to pass through a drawbridge during a scheduled closure period, the sound signal to request the opening of the draw during that period is 5 short blasts sounded in rapid succession. So this is where I found the answer, which was at kind of the end of B number 3. So I did have to read through a little bit to get there. And that's going to be the case in a lot of examples because it's not always obvious right when you find it. Now, it may not even be in the first section that you choose to look at. You may be on a wild goose chase for a little bit. Sometimes it'll also refer you to another regulation, and that's okay. Part of learning to use the CFRs is understanding how they're set up and how you might find things. I will say the more that you practice with it, the easier it does become. And you'll find that with a lot of Coast Guard questions that they usually focus on certain areas. And so if you can start to get comfortable with those particular areas like subchapter C, subchapter T, H, subchapter O, and so on, you'll find that you'll be in those sections quite a bit trying to find answers to questions. And so the more you practice with it, the better that you will be. Okay. Now, you'll have some questions related to subchapter J in your workbook, and you can practice those at the end. So now let's do a practice with subchapter C, okay? And so this particular letter comes close to the beginning of the alphabet. So if I were not writing my own little table of contents down like I suggested, I might just start towards the beginning of the 46 CFRs because ABC, it's pretty close to the beginning. I'll find that that is in parts 1 to 40. So I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to go into page 3. Now there's a lot of extra pages here at the front of all these books. Those are just generic pages that show up in the beginning of every Code of Federal Regulations. So you can skip all of those and go straight to page 3. And then towards the bottom of the page, we start to see the subchapter C, which is indicated right here. Okay. And so depending on what I'm looking for, might lead me into a particular section. Okay, so it tells me we have general provisions, we have requirements, we have operations, and we have towing vessels. Now, when we look inside of each of those sections, it doesn't tell us a whole lot of details of what that means. Like, what is general provisions? Well, the scope here defines it as having definitions, applicability, so who does it apply to, and then general requirements for uninspected vessels. In the operations section, it talks about some of the safety standards for uninspected vessels and so on. Now, you're not going to see that within the page 3 or 4 table of contents, but it gives you an idea of what it's about just by looking at this. Now, we are going to try to determine life-saving equipment. So how must personal flotation be stored or stowed? Okay, so if I'm just looking at the, page 3 or 4, I might determine that it probably doesn't fall under general. It might fall under requirements or maybe even operations, but let's start at requirements. And it tells me that whatever the page is that it begins on, and there it says it's page 330. So we're going to turn to that, and we're going to start looking at the more detailed table of contents for part 25. And so when I get into it, I have application, and then I have navigation lights, so that's not going to be it. And then I have life preservers and other life-saving equipment. Now that might be the area that I want to look, because the Coast Guard calls life preservers personal flotation devices. They change the name here and there. Life jackets, all kind of the same thing. And so now I'm going to further look into life preservers and other life-saving equipment. Well, I see application, I see definitions, I see life preservers and other life-saving equipment required, okay? I see markings, and I see storage. Now remember, our question asked, we'll go back real quick and just kind of look at our question. It asked us how personal flotation must be stored, okay? And so now I'm going to navigate to 25.25-9, okay? And remember, when you look at the corners of the book, it's going to tell you exactly which pages to go to, okay? So which pages would have 25.25-9? Well, I'm looking at my corners, and I see I've got 10.3 and 25.15. Okay, falls in this area. So now I'm going to get down to 25.25-9, and it tells me that life-saving equipment designed to be worn, required in 25.25.5, B and C, must be readily accessible. And what that means is that I don't have to go into a locked space to get it, or it's stowed underneath a whole bunch of cargo that I might have on board. I've got to have it readily accessible so I can reach for it and I can get it. It may be on a shelf. It may be even in a storage bin that's not locked or anything. It may be under a seat, but it has to be readily accessible. So I found that by going to part 25. I then navigated to life preservers and other life-saving equipment. I then navigated to storage, and then I used my pages in the corners to find 25.25-9. And I looked up that regulation, and I got lucky because it was fairly close to the beginning of it. Now, that will not always be the case. Sometimes we will have CFR information that we'll have to kind of dig into and really get into the meat of the subject and read multiple paragraphs, multiple pages, multiple citations, and that's all part of it, right? So the more you practice with the CFRs, the more comfortable that you will get. And so it's something that's not ever going to go away. If you stay in the industry long enough, you will use the CFRs for just about everything, whether it's testing or even just looking up regulations for your vessel. One of the things that you'll see a lot of times is that you'll ask someone what a policy is or what does a regulation say about X. And someone will say, well, I think it's this. And you'll say, oh, okay. Well, then next thing you know, you're getting a Coast Guard inspection, and that wasn't really the case. And so now you've been caught, not doing things the way that you're supposed to do. So I'm always of the mentality that, these regulations are here. They're easily accessible. If you're ever curious about a regulation, type in ecfr.gov. That's the electronic version of the CFR. And then you can do just a search. And a lot of times it will lead you directly to what you're looking for. So if you have a regulation question, or if you have a question that's on your exam that you're interested in looking up, go ahead and practice and use these CFRs to your advantage. A lot of times these questions are designed to be open book for you to find them. A lot of mariners just don't do it. So use it to your advantage and look these questions up so that 100% you get these things right, and also that you are abiding by the appropriate regulations when it comes to meeting Coast Guard standards. All right, thank you for paying attention during this lesson, and there's going to be some practice questions for those of you in the course. So go ahead and start challenging yourself with looking up those questions.